Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a piece of Canadian legislation that's really stirring up significant debate and concern across the country.
C-5, yeah. The One Canadian Economy Act.
Exactly. It's fascinating how one piece of legislation can touch so many nerves. This deep dive is built from, well, quite a stack of sources.
hmm
We've got major news outlets like Global News, The Guardian, Canadian Press, but also direct statements from Indigenous leaders, union reps, political commentators.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how this single bill manages to touch on so many critical areas all at once.
Right.
We're talking national economic strategy, trade relations, environmental protection, and, crucially, Indigenous rights and sovereignty.
So our mission today is really to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge from all this, helping you understand the core arguments, the different perspectives.
And why this bill has become such a flashpoint,
Right.
basically.
Yeah. So let's get right to it. What exactly is the Bill C-5 designed to achieve, and why is the Canadian government trying to push it through so quickly?
Okay, so at its core, Bill C-5 has two main objectives. First, it aims to break down those internal trade barriers across Canada.
Ah,
Think of, all those inconsistent provincial regulations on goods, services, even professional certifications.
right. Makes sense.
The idea is to make it much easier for businesses to operate across the country, fostering a truly one Canadian economy. This was actually a commitment Prime Minister Mark Carney made during the election.
And it's seen as a response to U.S. tariffs too, right? Under Trump.
Yeah, kind of a domestic economic bolstering move in that context.
So a national free trade zone, essentially.
Right.
And the second part.
Right, the second part. This is where it gets really interesting and quite contentious.
Okay.
It grants the federal cabinet some pretty sweeping powers to fast-track approvals for a small number of major industrial projects.
Like what kind of projects?
Things like mines, pipelines, ports. And they can do this by designating them as being in the national interest.
And the goal?
The ambitious goal is to grant these approvals within just 2 years.
2 years. For major projects like mines or pipelines, that sounds incredibly fast, especially given, the usual reviews.
It is very fast.
Is that the core reason for the government's urgency then? And why so many groups are raising red flags?
Absolutely. The pace is a major part of the story here. The Liberal government, well, they aim to pass it before the House rose for the summer recess, Friday, June 20th.
Tied to that Canada Day promise.
Exactly. Fulfilling that campaign promise about internal trade barriers by Canada Day. And to push it through, they used a closure motion.
Ah, cutting off debate.
Pretty much. It's a parliamentary tactic to limit debate and force a vote. They pushed it through a House of Commons committee, which is, a crucial stage for scrutiny in about 8 hours.
Just 8 hours. Wow.
Yeah. So this fast-tracking has been unsurprisingly widely criticized. Lots of groups saying there just hasn't been proper study or, importantly, consultation.
Building on that sense of urgency, there's been a fascinating sort of procedural twist regarding how this bill is actually being handled in Parliament, hasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. It really raises an important question. How can such a, comprehensive bill be rushed through like this?
So what happened?
Well, interestingly, on that Friday, June 20th, the House Speaker, Francis Scarpelleja, made a pretty significant ruling.
Okay.
He ruled that Bill C-5 actually has two distinct parts without a clear common element linking them.
So separating the trade barrier part from the fast-tracking part.
Essentially, yes. It's not just a procedural quirk. It kind of highlights how fundamentally different those two aims are. One's this broad economic policy. The other's a specific, very powerful tool for project acceleration.
And what does that mean for voting?
It means members of Parliament would hold two separate votes on the bill's third reading. That's the final vote in the House before it goes to the Senate.
So what does this ruling mean for the bill's passage in the short term? Will it pass?
Well, both votes are actually expected to succeed. It seems there's support from both Liberal and Conservative MPs on, well, both parts, largely.
Okay.
After passing the House, the bill then gets sent to the Senate, and they're scheduled to wrap up their look at it by June 27th.
So even splitting it doesn't really slow it down much, it sounds like.
Doesn't seem like it, no. The division itself is maybe a signal of its complex nature, but the passage seems likely.
Okay, let's shift to one of the loudest criticisms, and certainly one with the deepest historical roots. That's coming from Indigenous leaders and communities across Canada. What's their core message?
Yeah, this is huge. The overarching sentiment, you hear it again and again, is that they feel deeply slighted by Bill C-5. Yes. Because of a profound lack of consultation and a significant concern that their constitutional and treaty rights are just being overridden.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Grade Chief Greg Desjardins of Treaty 6 First Nations, he put it quite plainly. We have not been properly consulted in all the bills, all the legislation throughout. It's a one-shoe-fits-all in the government's favor.
Strong words.
Very. And Chief Troy Bossman Knowlton of Pequotty Nation called it a slight. There's just no other way to look at it. He warned it can destroy our past, our footprint. Tell the story today of who we are.
Those statements are incredibly powerful. They paint a really stark picture. When leaders warn of destruction and slights, what specifically within the bill's powers do they fear could bypass their rights or agreements?
Well, they worry that these broad powers to fast-track projects could let the government speed up approvals and effectively, bypass pre-existing laws and those crucial consultation processes.
And there was something specific about overriding laws.
Critically, yes. The bill initially allowed the cabinet to sidestep the Indian Act.
The Indian Act itself.
Yes, which is, the foundational, albeit often very controversial, legislation governing First Nations lives and lands. It also initially allowed sidestepping things like the Species at Risk Act, the Fisheries Act, all to get projects built quickly.
That seems like a massive overreach. So did the government make any concessions on that specific point?
It did, yes. After weeks of really intense criticism from First Nations leaders, the legislation was amended just recently, Thursday, June 19th.
Okay, what changed?
They withdrew the power it gave cabinet to sidestep the Indian Act specifically.
Right, but how was that received?
Well, Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak said these limited changes don't go far enough. And, significantly, she pointed out they were made without input from the rights holders themselves.
So still no real consultation on the changes either.
Exactly. She stressed First Nations are united and want prosperity, but they don't want it at the expense of our rights.
So it really sounds like it's not just the content of the bill that's the issue, but the very process, how it's being developed and pushed through.
Absolutely. That's a key theme. Kabawik First Nation Chief Lance Heyman called the whole thing a case study in how not to engage with Indigenous nations.
Wow.
Yeah. Citing a complete lack of meaningful engagement and recognition of their complex existing rights. Ontario Regional Chief Abram Benedict echoed that, saying they were not properly consulted before the bill was tabled and basically excluded throughout its study.
Which undermines that whole principle of free, prior, and informed consent, doesn't it?
Completely. And we've heard some pretty strong warnings of significant pushback if these concerns aren't addressed, right?
Yeah, definitely. Indigenous leaders have warned of widespread national protests. Some are even evoking Idle No More from 2012.
That's right. Chief Heyman stated, the conditions for an Idle No More 2.0 uprising are being written into the law as we speak.
Serious stuff.
And Anishinaabe Nation Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler also gave a stark warning. If you pass this Bill C-5, it will be a long, hot summer.
And potential legal action, too.
Yes, there are explicit threats of legal challenges if rights aren't respected, so it could be a battle in the courts as well as potentially on the ground.
So how has the government responded to all these powerful criticisms? What's their defense for pushing this legislation forward like this?
Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney has defended it. He stated that at the heart of this legislation is not just respect for, but full embrace of free, prior, and informed consent.
Okay. That seems to contradict what the chiefs are saying.
It does seem disconnected, yeah. He insists the legislation is about supporting nation-building projects and that, consultation, cooperation, engagement, participation are key.
And the minister?
Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc, he defended it by saying Canada is weathering a storm of change with the U.S. tariffs and needs to quickly bolster the economy and move these nation-building projects forward.
So the argument is mainly economic urgency and national interest.
That's the primary justification being put forward, yes.
But there still seems to be that disconnect you mentioned between these assurances of full embrace of consent and the actual concerns about the bill's wording, isn't there?
Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, while the Prime Minister has said his government won't impose a project on a province,
right,
that specific assurance is not actually spelled out in the legislation itself.
Okay. So it's just his word.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And critics argue his word is the only assurance, which they feel just isn't sufficient to protect provincial sovereignty or Indigenous rights.
Right.
Political promises can change, Wes, right? And you even had Liberal MPs like Marcus Pawlowski acknowledging the concerns, but basically saying it was important to pass the legislation quickly and, there'd be opportunity to amend it later.
Kind of like a get it done now, fix it later approach.
Sort of, yeah.
Eh.
Which doesn't sit well with many who feel the flaws are fundamental.
Okay, so beyond the really significant indigenous concerns, who else is raising flags about this bill? What are their specific worries?
Oh, yeah, there's a wide array of concerns. Environmental groups, for instance, they're warning the bill poses a significant threat to species at risk.
How so?
They see it as potentially an assault on science and democracy. Anna Johnston, she's a lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law, used a really powerful analogy.
Right,
She
yeah.
said, allowing cabinet to decide whether projects proceed before reviewing them is like building a house and then calling an engineer to ask if it's safe.
That paints a picture.
It does. And she also highlighted fears that the cabinet could withhold virtually all information about these major projects from the public. So a real lack of transparency concern.
Okay. What about concerns from, say, unions or other political groups?
Definitely. The Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, they argue the One Canadian Economy Act is a direct threat to workers' rights and public services.
Exactly.
They warned that allowing provinces to recognize comparable regulations for goods, services, labor could create a race to the bottom.
Meaning?
Meaning provinces might intentionally lower standards, things like environmental protections, worker safety, maybe even public service quality, just to be more competitive and attract investment.
I see.
They also worry about corporate lobbyists having an outsized influence on these project decisions without proper public oversight.
And politically, other parties.
Politically, yeah.
Huh.
The Bloc Québécois, the NDP, the Green Party, they've all criticized the bill as being undemocratic,
Why undemocratic?
concentrating far too much power in the Prime Minister's office and the cabinet. Bloc MP Xavier Barcelou-Duval questioned whether the minister would truly act in the best public interest, raising concerns about potential cronyism. And interestingly, even some conservatives expressed concern that the bill consolidates too much power federally.
And these concerns also extend to how the bill might affect Canada's north, right? A region often uniquely impacted by federal policy.
Yes, absolutely. Senator Margaret Dawn Anderson, she's the NWT's lone senator, expressed significant worry
About what specifically?
that the federal push to fast-track the bill might just overlook northern communities and their unique circumstances entirely. She highlighted what she saw as a telling disconnect
Okay.
in the bill's phrasing: Canada, including the North, suggesting, the North is seen as somehow separate, an add-on rather than integral.
Interesting point.
Yeah. And she stressed that Arctic security encompasses the safety and well-being of our communities, not just military stuff, and that sovereignty begins on the ground with the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights.
A powerful connection there.
And she issued a really stark warning against repeating history, where Inuit peoples were displaced to serve the interests of the state, a direct reference to past injustices in the North.
Wow. This deep dive into Bill C-5, it truly shows how complex and, well, multifaceted these legislative changes can be. It's clear this bill has the potential to impact pretty much everyone from major industries down to individual communities and their, deep-rooted connections to the land.
It really boils down to this fundamental tension, doesn't it? Balancing that economic urgency, the desire to get things done with these foundational rights, environmental stewardship, democratic accountability.
Right.
The push is clear, but the methods chosen and the potential consequences, they raise some pretty significant questions about what kind of nation Canada is actually building for the future.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? This deep dive, I think, reveals that delicate balance between national economic ambitions and those foundational principles. Consultation, rights, environmental protection. As you continue to follow the developments of Bill C-5, maybe consider this. How might this legislation, even with its stated goals of economic prosperity, actually redefine the relationship between the Canadian government, its provinces, and Indigenous nations for generations to come, and, crucially, at what cost?